Welcome to the Hashimoto's Doctor Podcast. You're now part of a growing community of people determined to take their health back through education and self-empowerment. But because of the healthcare system today, we don't have access to the types of healthcare that we want. So we have to do things differently. We've got to do things smarter, and we do that by becoming our own advocates. This podcast will give you the perspective and thoughts of one of the world's leading Hashimoto's doctors. So let's get started. Hi everyone, Dr. Shook here. Hope you're doing well today. In today's podcast, what I want to talk to you about is a controversial topic, a misunderstood topic, and one that I think is very important if you're dealing with thyroid disease or thyroid dysfunction, especially autoimmune thyroid disease and especially Hashimoto's, which is the most common form of autoimmune. It's the most common autoimmune condition in the United States. Is an immune process where your immune system attacks your thyroid, and it contributes to lowered quality of life. It causes hypothyroidism. It causes the thyroid to not be able to produce enough thyroid hormone, and it creates massive number of problems. It is what I primarily work with in practice, and it's something that I have an intimate relationship because when I was, my history when I was 6, diagnosed with ADHD, at 12, irritable bowel syndrome, well, what today would be called irritable bowel syndrome with constipation. That lasted until I was about 17, at least in a severe form. And then when I was 25, I was diagnosed with psoriasis. And then at 34, I learned that I had antibodies against my thyroid. And so for me, I have been on a journey of trying to help myself for a long time. And I've tried a lot of different things. That's kind of what led me here. That's what led me through formal training. I went through lots of self-experimentation, tried all kinds of supplements, had no clue what I was doing for the longest time until I started finding more evidence and evidence research-based and things that really worked, or that I had more evidence that worked. Let me say that, because I think there may be a lot of things out there that we don't have evidence for yet that work. So anyway, I was drawn to an evidence-based approach, and which is more, I like research that can support what we're doing, though this entire area of health, which we're looking at, a functional approach of working with the body as much as we can to support your physiology and health, is very, very hard to put into a randomized, double-blinded control study and get outcomes because it's so variable. People have so many different problems. And one of the very, controversial topics is this topic of how does gluten affect this autoimmune thyroid disease? What about celiac disease, which is a full-blown immune response to gluten that causes massive destruction of the lining of the intestinal tract, and it's an inflammatory bowel disease. How does that play into autoimmune thyroid disease and especially Hashimoto's? Because there's research that shows there's a connection, and a lot of people have heard if you have an autoimmune thyroid disease, and if you haven't, well then this is a great podcast for you. A lot of people have heard that if you have Hashimoto's or you have a thyroid problem, to try cutting out gluten and see how you feel, which is gluten is a protein found in wheat and some other grains, and so that's spread around the I should say the internet, and repeated or parroted by lots of different practitioners, even conventional physicians, some of them that have a more progressive approach at looking at autoimmune thyroid disease and how food might contribute. So let me kind of give you guys some clarification on this. So there was a study. Let's talk about this connection between celiac disease and thyroid function. Okay, I think this is a good place for us to start. So celiac disease, again, is a full-blown autoimmune response or immune response to gluten that causes massive destruction of the gut lining. One of the leading theories behind how autoimmunity develops is that the gut wall is broken down and becomes permeable or leaky, like this term leaky gut that you may have heard of. When the gut becomes leaky, it lets partially digested food proteins through the gut wall into the bloodstream, which triggers an immune response. It also lets bacterial and pathogenic byproducts through that intestinal wall into the bloodstream, which triggers an inflammatory response. The most commonly and the most researched bacterial byproduct would be lipopolysaccharides. You can look those up to your heart's content. I'll do a podcast on it if I haven't. in the future, I know I've done videos. So if you go to my YouTube channel, or if you go to the Office of Dr. Brad Shook on Facebook, you can put in LPS or lipopolysaccharides, and you will find a video where I explain the mechanisms, and it's a whiteboard video. The important thing to understand here is that there's a study. Let's talk about this study done. This was published in the Journal of Gastroenterology, American Journal of Gastroenterology in 2001, March of 2001. This was the study is titled "Prevalence of Thyroid Disorders in Untreated Adult Celiac Disease Patients and the Effect of Gluten Withdrawal." This is an Italian multi-center study. So what they did was the study, there were 241 untreated celiac disease patients versus they had another group of 212 people. That was their control group. And what this confirmed was that the patients with celiac disease were at an increased risk for developing thyroid disease. And what they saw was that in the celiac group, the 241, there was over a 3-fold higher frequency of thyroid disease than there was in the control group. So there was like 30% in the celiac group had thyroid disease, and in the other group there was 11%. So we knew from that study we knew that there was some association for some reason. So the question becomes, well, why? Well, why does it make a difference? Why is it gluten, or what is going on? And I think that we don't know for sure. That's what I'm going to tell you. Like, as of right now, we don't have solid evidence on this, but here's what we suspect. We suspect, one, that it could be that that gluten molecularly mimics. So the protein, part of the protein shapes of gluten has similar protein structures to our tissues, and whenever your immune system starts reacting against the gluten protein, the gluten molecule, partially digested protein of gluten, that the antibodies that are produced, because your immune system makes these things called antibodies. They're kind of like Post-it notes. They circulate through the bloodstream whenever the immune system sees this partially digested gluten protein floating around the bloodstream, and it's like, what is that? That shouldn't be here. The immune system makes antibodies against it. And what they do is these antibodies, they sample that partially digested gluten protein. This is an example, right? The immune system samples it and says, okay, we're going to make antibodies that will attach to this because we don't know what this is and we want to get rid of it. So we're going to make antibodies that will tag it, that will stick to it, and mark it for destruction by other immune cells. Well, so what we found out about gluten is that gluten it mimics the gluten, partially digested gluten proteins. They mimic human tissues, and in particular, one that there's mimicry to is the TPO enzyme, thyroid peroxidase enzyme in the thyroid, that's essential for the production of your thyroid hormone. So the problem becomes, number one, so how does this, again, like coming back to this, what's the association with this celiac disease or gluten to thyroid dysfunction? Is that, number one, we think that because of this mimicry, there's cross-reactivity. Cross-reactivity just means that these antibodies that should only stick to the gluten protein or partially digested gluten protein, they actually stick to and will adhere to other tissues, human tissues, that they should not, right? That we would not expect them to adhere to. And so they stick to, like, the thyroid peroxidase in the cells of the thyroid, and they contribute to an immune response against the thyroid itself. So it's called molecular mimicry, where the partially digested gluten protein looks like for example, the thyroid peroxidase, an enzyme in the thyroid. It's so similar that these antibodies, which are kind of like Post-it notes that stick to this, that are designed to stick to this foreign thing floating through the bloodstream that the body is leery of and wants to destroy because it's worried that it could be a problem, a pathogen. Those antibodies can also adhere themselves to some of our tissues. And that process where the antibody sticks to things that it wasn't really designed to stick to is called cross-reactivity. It reacts, you're having this adhesion or this sticking of the antibody, which is kind of like a Post-it note, to something it shouldn't. The immune system says, hey, it's marked for destruction, let's go destroy it, and it goes and does so. So that's the first mechanism that we suspect is occurring. The second mechanism is, well, there's this whole idea of leaky gut, right? So why would celiac disease people that have celiac disease that's untreated have a greater rate of thyroid disease or thyroid function, have problems with thyroid function? And it could be because, well, it causes massive destruction of the gut wall. The massive destruction of the gut wall creates a lot of permeability. So there's a lot of, like I said, partially digested food proteins, bacterial byproducts like lipopolysaccharides and things that leak into the bloodstream that trigger an inflammatory response and an immune response. And maybe because of that barrier system being broken down, there's this bombardment of all these proteins and inflammatory chemicals into the bloodstream, really flaring the immune system and priming it for attacking of our tissues through the process I just mentioned, through molecular mimicry of certain proteins, through cross-reactivity, right? And so it sets the stage and primes it, gets it hyper-reactive, puts it in a state of high reactivity, and that could be a mechanism as well. Those are the two, I think, leading theories behind how does celiac disease and a problem with in particular celiac disease contribute to thyroid dysfunction. So it's really interesting, I think, that there's that potential connection there. And we find that when we have people, remove gluten clinically, that a lot of people seem to improve. And some people have very significant improvements with just removing gluten. We know that there are a lot of foods that have similar protein structures as gluten. And because of that, your immune system may react to other food proteins as if it were gluten. They're called gluten cross-reactive foods, and they may stimulate the same kind of immune response as gluten. So there's a lot that we can do to look at what foods someone's reacting to. The question becomes like, okay, why have they lost tolerance to those foods in the first place? Like, why is their immune system reacting to them? Because they have to be crossing through the GI, the intestinal wall into the bloodstream, triggering this response. So why is there this loss of tolerance to the foods? And that comes down to, okay, what's the process behind the food reactivity? Is there actually a gut problem? Is there an inflammatory bowel problem that's breaking down the barrier system? What's causing the barrier system to break down and the allowing the food proteins in? Are there pathogens? Are there chemicals? Is it stress? Are there nutrient issues? What is actually doing that? Are there, and it's different for everyone because we all have different genetics, our genetic blueprint, so we're more susceptible to things in the environment. Some of us have, more susceptibility to chemicals. Some of us have better detoxification processes. Some of us have better, different susceptibilities to stressors and therefore to the negative effects of cortisol being elevated and chronic, stress responses. We have different things that happen in our life that will contribute to our expression of genes. We all have different lives with different levels of stress and different exposures. So this is why it's hard to put this into a randomized clinical controlled trial. One of the things that we do is we track with, assessment forms and we try to look at improvement or lack of improvement. And it's really difficult to put these, these approaches, the approach that I take, which is a method that I use, into a randomized controlled trial. That's why you won't see randomized controlled trials of these things, because it doesn't fit with that model of taking a group of people that have all the same problem. I mean, yeah, you could say autoimmune thyroid problems, but why do they have the autoimmune thyroid problems? It becomes a lot harder to control the variables. You just can't get a similar enough group to accurately or measure outcomes effectively. The things that fit really nicely into randomized controlled trials are drugs and things like that, where they're looking at 200 white males with a normal body mass index that have elevated cholesterol, and they give them a medication for a period of time, and then they measure their cholesterol with follow-up. It's a lot easier to measure that because that's a huge simplification of even their problems. But it's a lot easier to look at one marker. So anyway, this doesn't really fit into that. But I wanted to share, I've kind of gone on a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I wanted to share with you, these connections with gluten. I mean, this is the primary thing here. We think that there's an immune response to it, that, especially with celiac disease, we know that that it breaks down the gut wall, and that there are a few different mechanisms, molecular mimicry, where the gluten protein may look like our tissues, and then also the inflammatory process that just breaks down the digestive tract wall contributes to this increased permeability and therefore greater chance, we believe, of immune reactivity to food proteins and bacterial byproducts, things like lipopolysaccharides and whatnot, that drive the immune response. So I want to share this with you guys. I will follow up, and I'm going to talk to you about some other studies with this. I'm going to talk to you about a few different studies with autoimmune thyroid disease, diabetes mellitus type 1, so type 1 diabetes, which is the autoimmune type, and we'll talk about some more of those associations so that you can see similarities and some of the information that we have on gluten. But I don't really have that much time to go longer today, but I appreciate you guys. I hope this has been helpful. Appreciate you hanging out with me and listening to my ramblings. But I hope this gives you a little bit more information to be better empowered, become your own advocate, be better partners with your doctor, and ultimately take your health back. So I appreciate you so much. Hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed hanging out behind the scenes with Dr. Shook. You can also talk with and learn from Dr. Shook through Facebook Live on our Facebook page at the Office of Dr. Brad Shook. Don't forget, you can also get access to our videos, guidebooks, and thyroid programs at www.drbradshook.com. Oh yeah, and don't forget one more thing. We can change the world one person, one family, and one community at a time. Until next time, remember, today is your day, and no one will tell you who you are and what you can be.